Hello, everyone. This is Lucy Crow with Legislative Affairs and Analysis, and I'd like to thank you for joining our webinar. We're going to talk, there's three of us who are going to talk to you today. That'll be myself, Dennis Martin, and Rebecca Podsis. Dennis is going to start off the conversation, and then we'll move to me, and then a little bit later, Rebecca is going to talk to you about writing and editing reports. Dennis?
Hi, everybody. I'm going to be reviewing the first slide on your screen. I just want to let everybody know how important this process is, and how important legislative reports are. And what we focus on is it informs legislature and legislators and legislative staff on matters of policy as well as budget. I think one of the things that we also do is we inform an awful lot of a very wide range of stakeholders with these reports. These are all publicly available, both on the legislature's website and on our website, and they deal with a wide range of issues, some of which will be read very substantially. Others may have a very limited readership, but those people who are actually looking at these reports have an extremely strong vested interest in the substance of that report. And so it's very important that we provide quality, informative, and accurate reporting to the legislature. Obviously, this promotes government transparency with both the legislature, the governor, and our stakeholders. And in the long term, it helps to shape state policy. Many of these reports are designed to really look at issues, to talk about what we should do, what direction we should go, or how things are working, and that will inform both the governor's office, Office of Financial Management, and the legislature in terms of things or changes they may wish to consider related to our state policy and how we are conducting our business. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Lucy to start going through the process. Okay.
And I want to let everybody know that we do encourage questions as we go through the information that we're providing you. And if this were an in-person class, then we would just be, you guys would just be getting our attention that way. But it's my understanding, if you want to ask questions, there's a questions feature. Is that right, Ryan?
Yep. Yeah, there is a questions tab on the interface. You just type your question in there, and we'll take it down and answer it either at the end or at the time.
And we will try to address most of your questions as we go through the material. So I'm just encouraging you to go ahead and do that. Ask questions as we go along. So first, I'm going to talk to you about. It's going to be a real brief overview of the high-level legislative process. What you see on this screen is a high level of what Legislative Affairs and Analysis does. So we have to identify and assign legislative reports, and that includes assigning charters for each legislative report. And then we create an overarching project, and then there's a process where we approve the charters. And then we do editorial reviews on the first draft, final draft, and what we call a final pass version of each legislative report. We also manage the approval processes for the legislative reports, and that would be the agency executive approval process, which consists of the coordination team and then the agency director. And then we manage the OFM and Governor's Policy Office approval process as well. And then we submit reports to the legislature, and then there's a totally separate process related to legislative reports called quality evaluation process, and that's where a subset of reports are chosen to be part of this quality evaluation process, and we manage that process as well. Okay, so this next slide is a high-level view of what the divisions have to do in the legislative report process. So divisions have to create and submit charters for their legislative report. The next step would be that they start working on their report. So the charter would be basically a roadmap of how you're going to develop your report, along with a lot of other information. So you use that roadmap and you start writing your report. And then you're required to submit a first draft to LAA. And then the assigned editor for that report will then edit the report, and they will work with you, and you have to be available to the editor to work back and forth with them. That is even more important later in the process when you submit your final draft. So the next step is you continue writing your report, and then you get to the point where you can submit your final draft to us. And then again, the assigned editor will edit the report and work back and forth with you to get the report in a finalized, what we call basically publication ready, and ready to go, basically. And then the last step for you would be that if you're a report writer or a report lead, you have to be available to work on edits that would be requested as we go through the approval process. So anywhere in the approval process, we can be asked to change the report. That can come from the coordination team or the director, the agency director, or OFM can ask us to do edits, as well as the governor's office. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is the types of reports that we do. We actually identify two different types of reports, legislative reports. The first type is what we call a standard report. Standard report would be basically any legislative report that would fall into what we call a standard timeline, and that would consist of standard elements. So we've got some bullets here outlining what the common standard elements would be. Okay, it would require, it has a defined standard timeline, and then it would require a charter, first and second, or first and final draft. It would require the executive review and the OFM review and the governor's office review and approval. And it would have a target date for submitting to the legislature on time. And what that means is basically the legislation requesting the report gives us a date, most likely, that tells us what date we're supposed to submit to the legislature. So that's the date for submitting to the legislature on time. So all of those elements are what we think about when we label a report as being standard. Now, non-standard reports. So last year, if you were involved in the legislative report process, you might remember that we had a classification for reports called expedited reports. So expedited ended up as the first year that we used that term to identify any reports. And it worked in some ways and it didn't quite work in other ways. So this year, we have changed expedited to non-standard reports. Non-standard will hopefully encompass anything that is not that does not fall under the standard reports, basically those bullets that I went through a few minutes ago. So non-standard reports are a subset of standard reports. They still need to follow a defined timeline, And there's a few bullets that we've listed here in how they may differ from standard reports, and there may be other things that would make it differ from a standard report, but there's 4 here. They could be, a non-standard report could be completed early or late, and we would create a timeline for that if that were to happen, and like a project timeline in our agency project. It could follow a compressed or lengthened timeline. It could actually be, instead of what you think of as a standard report, it could be a letter to the legislature instead of an actual report. It could be shorter, meaning it would have 2 pages of narrative and then data that we're sending to the legislature. And this is not necessarily the only criteria that would qualify a report as a non-standard report, but this is what we see as would be the most common. We still don't have any questions yet? Okay. Remember to ask questions as we go along if you need us to clarify anything. So for the next slide, I'm going to hand it over to Dennis once again.
Okay. So now we've talked about standard and non-standard reports. So how do you, as the assigned responsible person, know whether something is standard or non-standard? Well, last year we tried to do that through the Legislative Affairs Office and make some assumptions about certain reports. And some of those assumptions were correct and some of those assumptions were not. So what we're really looking at doing is how do we get there? And that will be through the charters. The charters are important because if that's the first assignment that you will have. We'll be sending those out sometime in terms of the reports and what we're hearing from our executives in terms of which divisions are responsible and who are the staff responsible for those reports. And there'll be there'll be deadlines, and we'll be sending those out initially we'll be sending those out by division for each lead division to be aware of the responsibilities for charters. And in terms of the reason we need these charters is because we need to start strategically thinking about both the report and the parts and the process very early on. The project includes both your division, other divisions, in many cases external stakeholders, possibly communications with legislators or governor's office or OFM staff early on. So we need to think about all of those pieces and make sure we can maintain that we can meet our timeline goals. The key here, main goal, is high quality reports submitted to the legislature on time. The challenge for us is that the way we measure this on the fundamentals map is based on 100% delivering our reports to the legislature 100% on time. That is the goal. For us, within the legislative affairs staff and communications staff, we also want to build in high quality reports. To do that, we need you through these charters to tell us what are things that will change the assumptions we're making about this being a standard process. So this is your opportunity to tell us this won't fit for some reason within the standard process. We can't get that information to you by that date. We won't have the data we need. We have all of these other challenges in terms of resources or data. And the other challenge is that when you are thinking about this for your report, from an agency perspective, for both the leadership team and the coordinating team and our office and communications, we're seeing an increasing volume of reports every year, which means for us, in order to make sure we are processing these in the way the agency wants to, we need to make sure we are identifying these issues as quickly as possible, and we want to ensure that we are communicating with you and you are communicating with us and coordinating with us throughout the process, so we all know what the issues are if issues arise, and we deal with those immediately rather than waiting until one of these reports is due. So I think this is very important, and we really appreciate you spending the time to think about those issues in your charters. Thank you. And I'm going to turn it back to Lucy to talk a little bit about quality. Is that quality evaluation?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so I'm just going to talk pretty briefly about quality evaluation. A little bit earlier, when we were talking about the steps that the LAA does and then the steps that the division does to get the report submitted to the legislature, I mentioned at the very end a process called the quality evaluation process, and we just want you to be aware of what that is. So the quality evaluation is a subset of all of the reports that we're submitting to the legislature for the next period. Important thing to note is that the evaluation, it won't change the current report. So all of the editing in that is done in the other process, where you work with the editor and in the first draft, second draft, and then the editor looks at the final pass, that is where changes are made to the report. So this process does not identify problems with the report that need to be addressed right now. The process consists of 3 anonymous evaluators for each report, and then there's 2 separate evaluation points. The first evaluation point would be when you submit your final draft report to us. Then there's a quality evaluation point there. And then once we submit the report to the legislature, there's a final evaluation point at that time. And what we're trying to do is figure out what's happening with the quality of the report from the time that the lead person submits the final draft to us and the time that we submit it to the legislature. There's a lot of stuff that goes on with a lot of these reports during that time because there's the executive review happening. There's a final draft, editing, and then there's an executive review here at the agency, and then OFM and the governor's office look at the report. And so we're kind of trying to measure if the quality of the report is going up, the quality of the report is staying the same, the quality of the report is diminishing. And we built this process to try and quantify that. There are 6 measures that each report would be measured on, and I believe, Rebecca, that you sent out, you can find those measures if you're interested.
Yeah, and all the handouts from the email that I sent to everyone yesterday, if you look at the debriefing form.
Okay.
You have the legislative report quality evaluation debriefing form, and on the front page are all 6 of the measures.
Right.
In addition, the 6 quality measures are all listed in the charter template as a separate section, which for your information.
Yes.
So you can look, if you're interested, you can look at those measures at a later time. We're not going to go through them with you. And then the last bullet here is when the quality evaluation process is coming to an end, and we've done all the calculations, and there's a bunch of narrative that we provide, and we put it all into a debrief document, which is the blank debrief form that we provided to you that we were just telling you about. And then we provide that debrief document to the division who was lead on the report at the end of the debrief process. So this is later after the report was submitted to the legislature. It could be, up to a few months or even longer after the report was submitted, depending on if the report was submitted earlier in the year, like in October, or if it was submitted later, maybe in January or February of the next year. The debrief, the quality evaluation and debrief process doesn't come to an end until like around April, May time frame, after all the reports have been submitted to the legislature. And that's it on that, unless anybody has any questions. I'm gonna hand the rest of this over to Rebecca.
Hello. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about actually writing your report and mechanics around that. And speaking of mechanics, we're moving the phone around to make sure everybody hears it. All right. So the first question, I think the most basic questions are, what's a writer and what's an editor? So as the writer, you are going to write your report. You use the agency template, and you follow the plain talk principles and agency style and branding guidelines. You ensure the accuracy of your report. That includes all of the data and the analysis within it. You're ensuring the report fulfills what the legislature actually asked us to do, and you're telling the story about your program, project, or data. We'll talk a little bit more about that. The editor is available for technical assistance throughout the process. So before you even begin to write your report, if you have questions, want to make sure you are doing something the right way, let me know. I'm the primary editor. We will have some reports edited by other folks, just surely because the vast volume of reports we're getting from the legislature. There'll be a few ERB reports, DBHR, CQCT reports that are edited by others. And also Rachel Burke, also part of Legislative Affairs and Analysis team, may edit some as well. We edit the report usually 2 times with a standard process report and once when it's a brief report. And we also look at it one more time, just very, very briefly before it goes to the legislature. That's more of a T's crossed, I's dotted review. The edit is comprehensive. We'll look at the structure, the style, the graphics, and the writing itself. We may suggest rewrites, ask the writer questions, make some edits, of course, ourselves. But the arrow below on the bottom of the slide really shows this is a 2-way process. We want to work with you as editor and writer, and make sure any edits that we make are making sense for your content, because we're not the subject matter experts, you are. And like I said, if there's any point that you have questions, we are certainly available for technical assistance. So next we look at building a report. Now these 4 questions should look familiar to you because they were all talked about in the Writing for Your Audience online around 20-minute training that you all did before you signed up for this training. Now you probably saw that there is another Writing for Your Audience training that I certainly encourage you to take. It's an instructor-led course that is several hours long in person. If you have any questions about that too, let me know, but I highly encourage everybody to sign up for it who regularly writes any materials really with our agency. So the first question that training asks, and I'll ask too because it's very relevant for your report, is who is my audience? So who's your audience for a legislative report? Well, I think the obvious one, of course, are legislators. There's also legislative staff. We put our reports online, as does the legislature on their website, so the public may see it. Other HCA staff, other agencies staff may also look at it. Stakeholders in the community, the media. When you think about legislative reports, it's not really as narrow as I think they first seem. There's a lot of people who may be looking at your report. So what do you think that they want or they need? Well, the first thing to do is look at the bill that the report requirement came from and really think about what the ledge is actually asking us to do. If you're unsure about how to proceed on this, such as there might be policy implications that are a bit sensitive to consider in the topic, well, Dennis Martin is a really good source for that, to be able to talk through those issues, to decide how the agency would like to proceed on a policy level with writing your report. In addition to what the bill actually states, think about how to ensure we are giving our readers the full picture by actually telling the story. So what does telling the story mean? I think of an example that's pretty common in reports. So say the legislature asked us to give them data about some kind of pilot program, and we have preliminary data. What else might we want to actually put in that report? If you have this type of situation, think about what would be helpful to the ledge and what would be helpful to HCA. So we don't necessarily need to just give them the bare minimum. We want to explain, why is this issue important? Why is your program important? What impact does it have on real people? Interpret what the early data shows and give them reasons why they might want to fund this, have us, continue this program in the future. So it's good to be able to give the ledge some additional contextual data as a way of telling our story. Now, the key messages map is also included in the handouts that I emailed out yesterday, and I'd encourage you to review that too, because you can use that as a prompt to look at what our agency values are about how to also tell your story by explaining why your project or program really matters to the people of our state. How does it impact our clients? So I think the next big question, of course, is why will they read it? We've identified all these possible audiences. Why will they read it? And what will they do with the information? I think possible answers to this, again, include, who will read it and why, legislators and legislative staff and some of the other people. What do? They learn a lot about HCA's work by reading these reports. They're able to get into the research of an issue generally that's going to inform legislature's decisions on public policy issues. That impacts our agency budget. It impacts what programs we work on. This also speaks to the important role of why we need to provide that context and tell our story. So what do they not need in the report? Well, some of those superfluous details about our processes that don't add a lot to the report, you don't really need to include. Sometimes if we're developing a program, that could be every detail about how we've developed it, when we've held each stakeholder meeting, for instance. So remember, as you're providing context, to still be looking at what the actual big picture of it is. Another note on what they don't need, if you're including appendices, think about whether the appendices are really adding a lot to the report. If they're simply supplementing information that's already there, you probably don't need them. So really concluding that part is answer the natural questions that your readers may have. Don't leave them guessing about why the program matters and why we're sending the report to them, but also don't give them so much information that it bogs down your message. Does anyone have any questions so far? No, doesn't look like it. Okay. So next is sections. Now we have two handy documents that were also included in the email I sent yesterday, elements of a standard legislative report and elements of a brief legislative report. When you're writing a report, go through each of these, and it's going to guide you on exactly what sections are typically included in that type of report and how those sections should be structured. So first, I'll go through this a little briefly because you can look into it more on the elements document. But standard reports always include cover and contact pages. Follow the template, which is available on the LA SharePoint site. I'll make sure you have a link to for writing your actual report. And the document will show you also how to write the legislative citation and the due date to the ledge report. Also, in these first pages, you'll want to acknowledge if this is a joint report. If it is, for instance, we have some joint reports, especially with DSHS, we'll want to include their logo too. And I'm happy to help you if the time comes you need to do that. We also have a spot for acknowledgments. So if you'd like to thank a different agency, stakeholder organization, or others that have helped you put the information together, it's very appropriate to do that at that place too. We have the table of contents next. Now Word will actually build your table of contents as you go because the template is designed to use the Word styles, which will fold back into the table of contents. And start your table of contents, however, with the executive summary. The Word system will try to include your table of contents in your table of contents. Of course, you don't need to do that. So start with the executive summary. That's also the first page that has a footer that you include your due date and your report title as well. Next comes the executive summary, which I think arguably is the most important section of an entire report, because it's giving the legislators a brief snapshot of what is in the report. Now, a lot of people are in a hurry. People don't read quite as thoroughly as I think we wish they would, or maybe people used to do. So this is your chance to explain everything that's in your report in this short section. You should have an overview of the data, findings, or actions in your report. State whether this is an annual report, a preliminary report, or etc. Tell what the legislature actually asked us to do, including usually directly quoting the legislation. If it's super long, of course, you want to do that, but most of the provisos that direct us to do reports are fairly short. So after reading an executive summary, your readers should know exactly what's in your report just by the section. Next comes the report body, which is usually the longest section. Think of this as the meat of the report. This is where you're providing the actual information that the legislature asked for, including context and background information as well. You're putting your findings, your analysis, all of that. This is the part where you can actually tell your story, talk about your successes and your challenges and how you've overcome those challenges or you plan to. And this is also in a standard report where you include your charts and your graphs and, again, your analysis. Your conclusion is similar in some ways to the executive summary because you're restating your key findings, saying why it matters, again, just like you did in your executive summary, but you're adding a bit to that. It's a great place to tie in how real people in our state are impacted by what we do at HCA. Also, what's the future action? What are we doing with the program? Do we need to give the legislature information in another year? Are we continuing it, or was it a pilot project and now it's ending? Make sure the legislature knows what the next action is. Finally, we have appendices and attachments. Use these when they provide greater detail than what's already in the report. But make sure you reference each appendix or attachment in the report body itself. And for appendices, format them like the rest of the report. But attachments, of course, are separate documents entirely, so we don't need to worry so much about the formatting on that. Next is the brief report element, which you'll see is pretty similar to the standard, but there are some important differences. A brief legislative report should ideally have only a couple of pages in the report body. That's the part with your analysis and findings and whatnot. So the cover and content page also is collapsed into one page in the brief report. And then on the second page, you have a short legislative reference that just talks about what the legislature asked us to do and talks about whether the report is annual, preliminary, etc. Your summary statement acts kind of like a one-paragraph abstract, so a shorter version of an executive summary. It's giving a brief snapshot of the entire report. And your report body, which I said is the one that's around 2 pages for this, with your actual narrative of what the legislature has asked us to do. That does not have to include your data, though. You can put graphics that supports the report body after the actual report body, so that includes additional pages, not in that general page limit that we're looking at. And then finally, again, appendices and attachments. Look at those the same way you do as a standard report. Just make sure they're referenced within the report body itself. and that they're really giving greater detail to the report. Now, I mentioned that we have a report template. We actually have two, one for standard and one for brief reports, and they are on the LAA SharePoint site, which I will make sure I send an email out with that information on it so you all have it right after this training. Please always make sure that you use the current template. Even if you have a report that you've done in previous years and you're just updating some information, please transfer your content to the current template listed in the LAA SharePoint site. The reason for this is because we do make some changes annually to the template. Some of those you may see pretty easily, but some of them we make in the background of the formatting of graphics and logos and whatnot. It's especially important because right now one of our big initiatives in Communications Division is to make sure that all of our documents are accessible to those with disabilities. And our previous templates were not, so we make improvements on that front every year. Accessibility is a legal requirement that our agency has to fulfill. I also mentioned that the template utilizes word styles. And if you aren't familiar with word styles, please contact me and I'm happy to go through them with you. It's pretty easy. It's just kind of getting used to how you do it. On the picture here on this slide, it's just an example of how you can see the word styles. You know, you go up to from the home ribbon in Word and you'll see styles. And if you can actually click on there, and it will open up that right-hand pane, so it shows all the styles that you use in a legislative report. But like I said, if you're not familiar with that, don't worry about it. Just give me a call and I can tell you about it pretty quickly. And now, of course, charts and graphs and tables, oh my, that's such an integral part of many of our legislative reports. So when you're looking at creating graphics, think about whether the graphics are really necessary. In other words, do they expand or highlight something from the report? Please make sure they're clear and legible. They need to be editable, which means they're not just copied images from a snip or anything, but actually if we need to get in and change the color scheme or abbreviations or do some other formatting, that ensures that the editor is able to do that. Please limit abbreviations in your graphics. All the graphics should be able to stand on their own. So titles, all the labels should not have abbreviations. Now, obviously, sometimes there's just too much to put in a graphic. So if you do have to use an abbreviation, you include in a data note just below the graphic what that abbreviation means. So it still will stand on its own, and a reader should be able to look at that graphic and know what everything means without having to delve into the report itself. Make sure all graphics have consistent labeling. If you write Apple Health a certain way once, do it throughout the report and every graphic, for instance. Make sure every one of them has a number and a name that you reference in the report so people can see, your readers can tell exactly where the graphic links to information within your narrative. Titles and notes all follow template styles as well. So I included a little example there of what the data headings, so your title, and what the data note, which includes additional information below your graphic, should look like. I should note that with the increased load of legislative reports that the legislature has graced our agency with, if we get really graphic heavy reports that do not follow these guidelines, we may have to simply return it to the division for correction. Although we'd be happy to help format for you, there are a lot of reports that come in to edit all at the same time, and we do have the expectation that writers are going to follow these style guidelines. When you're creating your graphics, you can create charts in Word or Excel. And some of you are probably familiar, but if you're not, if you see the arrow going to that right-hand graphic, it shows how to create something in Word. From your insert ribbon, click chart, and it will start you on the process to be able to do things right within Word. And you can import Excel graphics into Word. And that bottom graphic shows that you again go to the Insert tab, but instead go all the way to the right where there's a little box that you can see I've shown the drop down for that talks about objects, text from files that you can import a lot of information in. Again, if you have any questions about how to do these things, please just let me know and I'll help walk through that. Okay. Now, also, I've mentioned the HCA branding guidelines. We do have an HCA brand guide color palette, and I don't believe I sent that to you in the handouts I sent yesterday. However, I'll make sure you have the link for that in our follow-up email. And we also have a link from the LAA SharePoint site to get to the HCA brand guide. The color palette is especially important, and I think we've all changed colors a lot, and this may be super easy for some of you, and some of you haven't really gotten to delve into this yet. So when you color most things in Word, you'll first get that general theme color options, like the graphic that you see on the left. And then if you click the More Colors at the bottom of that left-hand graphic, the middle graphic on the slide is going to pop up. And then you can click on Custom, and that will bring up that right-hand picture that's on the slide, where you can customize any color that you want to. So I've included how to make HCA blue, which is on that slide, which is red 0, green 119, blue 200. And if you put those numbers, just type them in to the red, green, and blue section in that right-hand picture when you're at that option. Click OK, it'll give you that exact color.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So then when you put that custom color in, then does it automatically display then from there on out in your color palette?
That's a good question. It will display in your color palette when you first go to the theme colors option. As it won't show it forever, but I think it shows it all the time for that document. So yeah, so you don't have to go through that entire process every time. Good question.
Okay.
Yeah. Here is an example. This was actually modified from a 2018 report that we had on the impact of telemedicine. This was an actual graphic that was included in the report to the legislature. So you'll see the title, which also has a number, graph 3, telemedicine, etc. You'll see that both the X and Y axes are properly labeled. And we have a data note at the bottom that shows where this data came from. Next one, of course, plain talk, please. You probably hear that a lot through all of government, plain talk. So what does that actually mean, though? First, please be clear and concise. You want your reader to understand what you're saying the first time they read it. This is really important with legislative staff because they often browse through reports because they're really pressed for time. They have a lot of things to read, often in a very short amount of time. Also, if folks find the report online, and even particularly newer legislators, they might not have a lot of experience with the topic, so you're really educating a reader as you go while giving them really concise information. Be conversational. We don't always have to say HCA did this or the healthcare authority this. You know, if it's a known entity that we're talking about, the healthcare authority, you can say we did this, we filed this, we plan on doing this. So use some personal pronouns in there. Use the simple word over the more complex. Instead of implement a program, maybe say start a program. I'm sure you can think of a lot of other examples with the work that you do. And you know, even online, there are some good resources. If there's several spots where you can find online examples of common government words and the simpler word to use. And I find those things too, which is how I know they're online, because it is a challenge sometimes to kind of debureaucrat some of the language that we typically use in a government agency. Please use brief sentences and short paragraphs. The American Press Institute actually found that as your sentence length goes up, your readers understand less. And this is true for even very educated readers. So while 90% of your readers can understand a 14-word sentence, that actually dropped down to less than 10% understood a 43-word sentence. So again, that's the difference between a 14-word sentence and a 43-word sentence. Huge difference. Break up your text as much as possible. Use bullets, graphics, subheadings. Readers scan pages. They do this online and they do this in print documents as well. So you want to help them find the content they need quickly. Try not to use industry terms. Sometimes we have to, but minimize it. Sometimes technical terms are necessary, but if you do use technical terms, make sure you're explaining what they mean. Pay one, transformation, triple aim. We use so many industry terms in HCA. Don't just say also transformation, blah, blah, blah refers to, but give a detailed description of what that concept means. You can do that actually in footnotes if you don't want to actually break up your narrative too much with it. Also, and related, avoid jargon and buzzwords. These sneak into all of our language. Stakeholdering, turnkey, leverage. These are a few examples. So keep that in mind as you're writing. And frankly, if you write your first draft of a report, sometimes I find it easy to then just go through a report or something I've written one more time, and I catch things like that faster the second time I'm really looking at it from the editor perspective instead of just as the writer. Acronyms. Make sure, of course, you define all your acronyms on the first use. A few examples we use in HCA, including a SPA, Apple Health. Make sure you're defining those. Actually, the style guide for HCA defines how you should write at Washington Apple Health, our Medicaid program, at the first reference in a report, and then at the subsequent times you use them. I want to check that out too. If you only use an acronym a few times, you really don't need it. I think about 3 times is pretty standard. If you use it less than that, just write the term out every time, because acronyms are really dragging down your reports by making it more difficult for people to understand. Especially if you have a lot of acronyms in a report, which sometimes, especially longer reports, it's hard to avoid, consider including a glossary of acronyms as an appendix that your reader can really go to quickly to remind themselves about what all the terms mean. Another part of plain language, and a very important part, is be active. Active voice is such an important part that it deserves its own slide. We probably learned a lot how to write in passive voice. I still do it in my school writing. I went back to school a couple of years ago and do research. And boy, that type of writing is full of passive voice. There were 212 participants in this study, for example. A lot of us, I'm sure, have written like that through college. But we want to try to stop doing that in our writing for HCA. Like too many acronyms, like too much jargon, passive voice drags your writing down and makes it harder for people to understand, can overly complicate sentences, and even make the meaning of your sentences less precise. For example, a good passive sentence: the rulemaking agenda was filed in April. Based on that, who filed it? Who's accountable there? That doesn't really tell the legislature and others a lot of information. Say instead something like HCA filed the rulemaking agenda in April, or we filed the rulemaking agenda, if we know that we're talking about HCA at that point. A simple way to think about active voice is that you put who did something at the beginning of the sentence. Also, if you have a lot of words in your sentences like is, was, or of, ask yourself if you're writing in passive or active voice. because a lot of times if you have those words, you're probably writing in passive voice. Now, I know there are a few times that it's just the convention that you write in passive voice, and it's okay. I know that happens. For instance, we don't refer to people who have been victimized or who have a particular condition as that condition. We want to take the emphasis off of the person and the condition, separate them. And so we're recognizing the person is not that condition or experience, such as we might say, those who experience domestic violence, which is passive voice, but it's okay. But just try to minimize it. And finally here, we have some resources, which I'll make sure that you know exactly where those are by sending a email out. On the SharePoint site for LAA, we have all the templates, we have the elements documents, quick reference document, which I included in your handouts, that shows a lot of shortcuts of commonly encountered issues that I've seen in reports that the style guide covers. So it might give you some good quick information. We're also finishing a checklist, which might be helpful to the writer and to your division generally, to ensure that you've met all the requirements for your report. And we have the HCA Style Guide and the HCA Brand Guide, which the HCA Communications Division owns and has compiled and does updates every year as well. At that, we'll turn it back to Lucy for a minute.
Okay. So we've just got some scenarios that we want you to think about here at the end of our discussion. A lot of times people have questions. We want to encourage people to actually get a hold of us when they have questions. Our first example will be, what if my report draft is going to be late to LAA? So what would you do? We want you to notify us through HCA Legislative Review to discuss options. Or you could contact one of us individually, but just know that the way that we're asking people to contact us, get people comfortable with contacting us is through email, because there's always somebody who's going to be monitoring the email box. So the second example would be, what if the information that the legislature requested will not be available by the time the report is supposed to be due? And this would be by the time the report is supposed to be finalized from you and then sent to Legislative Affairs and Analysis. Notify us. Send us an email. Let us know what's going on, and that way we can figure out how we're going to triage that, if we're going to submit it at a different time, if we're going to contact the legislature, that sort of thing, and let them know what's going on. The next example would be, what if I find an error in a previous report? And this example is basically, if you realize there was an error in a report that was submitted last year or the year before, for example, what do you do? Make sure to let us know, because we will evaluate what that, if it's an error that would require us to submit an updated report to the legislature. And so this is just to get you thinking about, hey, communicate with Legislative Affairs and Analysis about any questions or anything that you might need help with. And then in ending, we've just provided you our contact information in case you need to contact any of us. And it doesn't look like, Ryan's saying, we don't have any questions from any of you. We do encourage you to get a hold of us if you need help developing your report, if you have any questions. Rebecca is going to be, in a little bit after this webinar, she's going to be emailing out a follow-up with some information. And Dennis, do you have any final closing comments you'd like to make?
No, I just, the only thing I'd like to do is just thank everyone for attending, and I just want to echo Lucy's comments. Please contact us as soon as possible. If something changes in your report that's different from what you told us in your charter, it's very helpful to not only let us know, because you have a project and we have a project, and we need to be working together. And I think a lot of the places where we end up increasing the resources needed to complete a report occur when we do have those communication breakdowns. So again, thank you for attending, and I really appreciate close coordination with everyone on each report. Thank you.
And that will end the webinar. Thanks. Goodbye.